Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I am joined today by, as usual, by Steve Damaris. Steve, how you doing, buddy?
I'm in wonderful shape for the shape I'm in.
And we are also joined by Dr. Mark Turner. Mark, it is official now, isn't it?
I do believe so.
All right. Well, congratulations. Well deserved. Well deserved. So
Yes,
Mark
sir.
just finished up his PhD at the University of Tennessee, working with Dr. Craig Harper, and had a phenomenal, in my very biased opinion, he had a phenomenal research project, and that is actually what we're going to discuss today. And so in a moment, we'll let Mark kind of introduce the theme of the project and kind of how it broke down into various topics and chapters and so forth. But Steve, where we're going to start with this is really Mark needed a way to assess buck quality by using harvest data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you and I have struggled with for years and years. And I hate to say it, but a couple decades, we've kind of struggled with that of what is a true indicator of buck quality. So Mark's going to provide a solution to that, but that's where we're going to start.
And you said in a moment, that means I only have a moment to kind of give my contextual integration intro to the topic.
I'm going to give you 3 moments.
3 moments. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, and Mark, this is a topic, condition evaluation, evaluating population herd health is something I lecture on for hours and hours in my big game class. So I'm going to have to really work at keeping it short and concise, but I will do my best. And Bronson, if I see you doing this, I guess that means like wrap it up.
Speed it up, buddy.
Okay. So I really think, the larger context is our listeners. Many of them own properties, many of them hunt leases, and they're all greatly interested in this passion and understanding the condition in the herd, the quality of the herd and the quality of the habitat, because those two things go hand in hand, and it's truly an investment that they make, blood, sweat, tears, money, investing in this population of deer. And we talk a lot on here about habitat management, and I mean, you come from the mecca of habitat management, University of Tennessee and Craig Harper. So we're always talking about having deer habitat and deer populations as good as they can, and good is really a relative term. And as a biologist, our goal is to understand what a landowner or the managers of the deer population want from a population, and within the context of what they want and what they have and what they can do moving forward, we have to make recommendations to them and evaluate the recommendations over time to tweak them, because there's no Bronson and my old friend Bob Griffin used to say that there's no such thing as cookie cutter deer management. You have to customize your management to each individual property and set of circumstances. So a good quality biologist is going to understand that and work to understand the landowners or the decision makers' perspective on what they want. But then you have to then evaluate what's there and monitor it moving forward. And it's truly an investment, emotional, physical, financial investment. And so I like to use the analogy of a financial planner. And I'm not one. and anything I say here is not recommended to be applied to the stock market or anything. But we, as a biologist, we need to know what the market forces are, what's going on our population and the property. And if financial advisor wants to start out, what are your financial goals? What do you see moving forward? When do you want to retire? How much spendable income do you want to have? All those kind of things are relatable to a deer management scenario. And that financial planner, once they understand your goals and where you want to go, just like a biologist, we have to understand that. And then we can start figuring out, well, here's what you have now. And that financial planner says, okay, that you've got, you only have this much, then you need to start saving at a higher rate, investing in these kind of strategies and all that. So a financial advisor wants to monitor the resources that they are managing for their clients. And you can say, well, yeah, I just want to invest in the stock market. Well, there's different ways to invest in the stock market, and you need to evaluate how those investments are going forward. They have to understand, your goals and objectives, customize the investment strategy, and then evaluate it. And much like a deer population, we have to understand what they want. They being the landowners or the managers, the decision makers, what do they want? And then we figure out how to measure that effectively. So we use, much like an index fund in financial planning, they have this, certain stocks they look at as an index to the investments in technology. How's it going? And what can we do moving forward? We have metrics that we use from our deer population and our habitats to index the health of the population. And when I say an index, it means an indicator of how the population are they being successful? And from a nutritional standpoint, we want a deer population ideally to be able to express their genetic potential for the specific age and sex class that you're looking at. So you don't expect yearling bucks to have antlers as large as a 3-year-old buck. You have to understand the year class and how big of antlers do you want for a property. That's a function of management goals and objectives. And do you want to harvest 2- and 3-year-old bucks or 3- and 4-year-old bucks, or you want to reach out and harvest the largest antlers that you could possibly produce on a property? Then you're talking 6 and 7 years of age for harvest targets. And then whether or not you manage selectively harvesting bucks. I mean, there's so many different things, but the point is, as a biologist, we look at population characteristics and habitat characteristics. We've all done browse surveys. You go out and look at relative browse pressure on selected forages. Those are indices to the health of the habitat. And we do the same thing with basically harvest data, because that's the cheapest and easiest thing to get a hold of. We can't go out and sample live deer on a management property. We're constrained by logistics. So we use harvest data. Now, harvest data has some real issues with it, and Bronson alluded to that. And one of the things is harvest selective bias. As soon as you don't shoot the first buck that comes along, you've assigned a bias to your harvest decisions. And we do that all the time purposefully. But you have to understand that there is a bias. And so you can't just use harvested bucks anymore to manage a deer population because of the harvest bias. And, I've had properties where I've worked with in the past where we used lactation rate on does as an indicator of fawn recruitment. Then I get talking to a group of hunters from the property, and I'll say, well, how do you make a decision on which doe to harvest? And half of them will say, well, I'll shoot the barren does. And the other half shoots another kind of deer, or the first doe, or the biggest doe, as opposed to the smallest doe. And all those decisions affect whether or not you can validly use a lactation indicator and at what age you can apply it for. So, all right, we have this harvest bias problem that we have to get around. And I'll interject some other issues later, but go ahead and jump in, Mark.
Yeah, so no, but I think that sets us up in a good place, because really, the whole point of my research project was to evaluate kind of bigger picture, I guess, taking a little bit of a step back. We're trying to look at how deer body and antler size varied across most of the eastern U.S. So I had sites across 25 different states that I included as part of this project that were collecting harvest data. And so we were trying to assess essentially what habitat characteristics are associated with bigger deer. Things like forage availability, landscape coverage, climate, specifically temperature, things like that, which I think we'll dive into maybe in a later episode. But for right now, kind of at the start of this, whenever we first were getting this project off the ground, Dr. Harper as well as Bronson and I had a meeting down in Mississippi, and we discussed this issue of harvest bias because this is a huge deal. Especially when you think about hunters from different areas. I mean, a hunter in Iowa is probably going to make different harvest decisions than a hunter in South Alabama or South Mississippi, for instance. And so there's also an issue of, property size and things like that. Some properties may be shooting 5-year-old bucks, whereas some others with smaller, land holding may be practicing more of what we'd refer to as, traditional quality deer management. Shooting mostly 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and only a few bucks are able to reach full maturity. And so we have all these issues with bias from these different areas. And something that we kicked around the idea of was, using doe body weight. That's something that's been used a lot in the past to assess herd health, and a lot of folks use it in various places. And it's something that I think all of us have used in the past. But interestingly, there's, at least before now, not been any information in the literature on how doe body weight might correlate with male antler size. And if you're a manager of a small property or a landowner of a small property, or if you're, say, a state deer biologist trying to assess variation in morphology across the range of an area, certainly understanding that relationship could help because as Steve alluded to, there are some issues with female harvest data as well. But most of the time, if a hunter's going to shoot a doe, that they may be shooting the larger doe, but they're probably not making as in-depth of a decision as they would be harvesting a buck. Just simply because most people, if they're trying to shoot a doe, they're trying to fill the freezer up. Now, if you're like my advisor, Dr. Harper, you might try to shoot the younger does to have maybe a little bit better meat quality, but for most folks, they're probably just shooting the first doe that they get a good, clean, ethical opportunity on.
So what you did, and that's something, Mark, I don't know if you remember this, but when we had that meeting, we kind of went around the room and we said, what do we think is the weak link? What do we think it might be the most problematic thing? And we all agreed with that. The whole point of this project, it's a lot deeper and wider than this, but the end goal was, how can we explain variation in buck antler size, not just in a small place or property to property, but literally across a swath of area that represents white-tailed deer. So literally from the Gulf Coast all the way to, I think your most northern study site was Minnesota. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a really big chunk of land there. Recognizing that you are going to hunted properties. You're not going to properties where there's another type of antler data collected. In other words, it's not a project like in South Texas where you can get up in a helicopter and randomly capture the very first antlered buck, that you come across. We are using data from a bow and a rifle. And as Steve alluded to, there's always some bias associated with that. So that is something that I had tinkered with the Mississippi data. If you remember, we talked about that, of how I had looked at that, and I thought there was a correlation, as there should be. And I guess I want to point that out too, Mark. This may not make sense to everyone, but certainly to a deer biologist. If you did not find a correlation, at least a weak correlation at a population scale between doe body weight, average doe body weight, and average buck antler size, something's wrong with your math. Yeah. I mean, there should be a relationship there. The utility of this and what you developed is that you now have a predictive equation, And now you can take what is average doe body mass and predict from that what antler size should be. And so with all of these properties that you looked at, is that you could now use doe body weight as a surrogate, as a replacement for antler size. And so it just gave you a lot of strength in your analyses, and it eliminated a lot of the harvest bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that, like I said, that was something that we were really nervous about going forward. Was kind of how we were going to deal with that. And one of the other issues with males, so not only with males do you have this harvest bias that occurs, but I think it's also important to point out the sample size issue. So on most properties that, average land holding size, not, 5,000 acres or something like that, your data set on males is probably going to be limited. Even if you're shooting 5 males a year, that's really not enough to tell you all that much about variation in antler size based on your management. Certainly not at the year level. Maybe over the course of 3 to 4 years, you could see some trends one way or another. But most properties are harvesting, at least especially in the South, but and across a lot of the whitetails range, they're harvesting a lot of does. Probably not as many as they should be, just on the average, but certainly your female data set is going to be much more robust from just a pure number standpoint, and that really becomes important, especially whenever you consider the variation in antler size by age class. And so if you consider, if you're on most properties, again, they're probably not shooting 1 or 2 year olds, but they're shooting some 3 year olds, some 4 year olds, and then some bucks that are, 5 to 6 plus. And again, depending on the management strategy, it may be mostly 3 year olds, or it could be a few 3 year olds and mostly 4 and 5 year olds. But a 3 year old on average only has about 78% of his total antler size, whereas a 4 year old has about 92%, and then a 5 year old plus, although they can go up slightly from 5. Most would consider 5 as about maximum antler size, especially outside of places like Texas and things like that. And so you end up in a place where you have to pretty much stratify your results. And so you can only consider the 3 year olds, or you can only consider the 4, or you can only consider the 5 year olds using a traditional approach. Whereas with females, although female mass does go up slightly from 2 to 3, we found that, and skipping ahead just a little bit, we found that using just adult female mass, so including all does that are at least 2.5 years old in the harvest data, is a pretty good predictor of male antler size, which is nice because you don't even have to get into aging, based on tooth wear. You don't even really have to pull a jawbone if you want to. You can open the mouth and see if she's got look at her third premolar and know whether she's an adult or a yearling or a fawn. And so at that point, if you can include her in that data set or not.
And so the fundamental and underlying relationship here, it's a density dependent type relationship, just simply meaning, is there enough food for the population? It may be that that population is limited simply because there's too many deer. It may be that there's not any habitat management. That can be habitat as well as food plots, etc. But the bottom line is that a population that is food limited, you're going to see the same result in terms of your doe body weight will be below average, and your buck antler size and body weight is going to be below average. So fundamentally, that is what we're working with. And so if we have greater habitat quality and or ideally both controlling density, and we have increased the fundamental relationship that now there is an abundance of high quality food, the does are going to respond in a similar fashion that buck body weight and buck antler size is going to respond. So you're just using that relationship there that both bucks and does are going to positively respond to increases in the ratio of food per unit area for the population. So with that, Mark, you had all these different populations, again, from the Gulf Coast to Minnesota and everywhere in between. Was the relationship more or less consistent as you went from south to north? And for those people that are severe nerds like myself, you could kind of get to where, if you were looking at a chart there, the data plotted, was the slope about the same? And if I remember correctly, Mark, everything outside of Mississippi, that was all one comparison. And then you did a separate analysis for Mississippi where you could look at some regional comparisons. But if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, so essentially the way that we approached this initially, I just wanted to use the sites that were, where we were working with landowners to collect harvest data off of deer from their properties. And so for this specific analysis, that included 31 sites across 19 states, kind of like Bronson said, ranging from Central Florida up to New York and Minnesota, and then across to for this analysis across to Kansas. And so we had a pretty good geographic area there with properties scattered about. And as you might imagine, at that scale, it becomes kind of difficult to assess some of the more fine-tuned things that might be going on with this relationship. And so I was also interested in looking at things at a statewide level. And so I was able to work with Bronson as well as William McKinley to take advantage of the DMAP data set that y'all have been collecting in Mississippi for several years and assess it at the club level. So, comparing whether clubs that had larger does would also have larger antlers. And so seeing at a smaller spatial scale whether that relationship might vary compared to looking at things across, essentially most of the eastern U.S. The other thing I was able to do at that finer scale was include some of the regional effects that might be happening. And so specifically, and I know that y'all have discussed variation in deer size. Y'all tend to have smaller deer in the lower coastal plain with the largest deer in the delta and then the upper coastal plain. And I know Dr. Harper probably won't listen to this, but if he does, forgive me because I'm going to say it. The Lurse Hills.
There you go.
Lurse,
I was waiting to make sure you said it correctly.
That he doesn't like that extra R in there.
I know.
And so anyway, so that region is kind of intermediate. And so those differences in region size or in deer size across those regions based on forage availability, we're interested to see whether that might influence that relationship to where, say, if you're trying to use a predictive equation in the delta, maybe it has a different slope and there's a different relationship between body size and antler size.
And Bronson, if I ask you to remind me and talk a little bit about that consideration there, like in our earlier DMAP analyses, we saw that maximum body size is reached a year or two earlier in the Mississippi Delta region compared to the lower coastal plain. And you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So what we found with those data, and makes a lot of intuitive sense here, but essentially the maximum value, the average maximum value for bucks in the Delta was pretty much diminishing returns at 4.5. Meaning, to express that numerically, it might be that at 4.5 bucks in the Delta region, we're already at 97, 98, 99% of their maximum. Where if you contrasted that with down on the coast in that region at 4.5, they may only be at 75 or 80%. And so you essentially saw that the slope of the rate of growth for antler size was much sharper or steeper in the Delta region. They basically got to their maximum antler size quicker because of food availability, versus down on the lower coastal plain region, it was more like 7.5 before they reached a maximum size. And so, yes, Steve, that's really kind of what I was getting at with talking to Mark about this is when I was nerding out and talking about slopes being different, then that essentially means that in a particular region, if you had an increase in doe body weight, would you have the same increase in antler size throughout the range of the whitetail? So hypothetically, like in Mississippi, it might be that you have to have a greater amount of increase in doe body weight to see a corresponding increase in buck antler size.
Right. Yeah. So essentially, interestingly, whether you looked at things from a national perspective or, across the eastern U.S., or if you looked at things just really honed in on Mississippi, the relationship between doe body weight and adult male antler size stays very consistent across the range, which was really interesting. And so for every 10-pound increase in adult female body mass, we would expect to see about an 8.5-inch increase in gross Boone and Crockett score in mature males, which is really exciting because that's something that I think is attainable on a lot of properties. There's a lot of good habitat management work that could be done to improve things on nearly every property, especially the ones that I sampled. And so that 10-pound increase in female body mass is really not that big of a jump that might be necessary. And just to provide a little bit of context, whenever we looked at the average size, so kind of like what Bronson was talking about, I just shared the slope of that equation. But if we actually project things out, 120-pound doe on most properties, at least the ones included from both Mississippi as well as from that more large-scale data set, would correlate with about a 139-inch buck. So if you can produce 120-inch does, your average mature male is going to be 139 inches, which if you're sitting in Iowa right now or want to move to Iowa, that might not sound that great until you step back and consider that that's just the average, male antler size and female body weight, but, especially male antler size is a bell curve, and there's going to be some on the right and some on the left. And so, if you're having 140-inch bucks on average, you're probably going to be some that at least, or if you have a large enough number of deer and don't have a bunch of high grading going on, you're probably going to have some that are at least gross Boone and Crockett that are going to be at least getting close to that. So for a lot of places, that's kind of the benchmark to shoot for.
And that is really, really good news too, Mark, as you alluded to. That's something that's attainable. Now, I'm speaking for Mississippi and kind of the deep South and not the Midwest or anything like that. But you could see there being some areas where unless you had some really more landscape level influences, getting to on average, 120-pound does could be a heavy lift. But there are a lot of places, I would say there's more places to where that would be very, very attainable to do that. And I've worked with places, Steve, you worked with places where they are doing that. I mean, right now, their average doe body size is 120. And again, that's just the average. A lot of these places are also harvesting does, because I see the data just like you, that are 140 pounds, 150 pounds. Some places, even in Mississippi, shooting 160, 170-pound does. So when you're able to do that and then shift the mature buck average antler size to essentially 140 inches, that means you're also going to be producing a lot of 160s and 170s. So I love the story here because it makes biological sense, and it just demonstrates tangibly that when you give them food and you manage the habitat, doe body weights respond, bucks respond, antlers respond, and so it all works out really well.
Yeah, I think one important caveat that I think is somewhat of a strength of collecting female data, but managers and hunters should be aware of, is that there may be a delayed response in seeing that change in antler size compared to female body weight, which again is a good thing if you're thinking about this as an index, because it's telling you what's going on faster than it would be if you were just evaluating male antler size. And so you can see what you might expect. But as we mentioned before, we're including all females that are at least 2.5, whereas most folks, especially if they're really trying to maximize antler size, are not going to be harvesting at least their best deer until 5.5. So at that point, you've obviously got a 3-year gap there built in automatically. And then you combine that with potentially, there may be some effects from epigenetics that may have an influence on males more strongly than females, because of course, a lot of the males on any given property are dispersing from off the property. And in addition to that, you're having a delayed generational effect within the females, but typically you should see that change in females faster than you see it with males. So I say all that not to take away from it, but just to say that, just because you see a 10-pound bump in does doesn't mean you're automatically going to see that 8.5 on average inch increase in antler size. There probably is going to be some delay to that occurring, but nonetheless, the relationship's there.
It also should be very informative if you're a property manager, hunting club, et cetera, and you are routinely, let's say you've been collecting harvest data, and you might be listening and say, we shoot 120-pound does all the time, 130, 140-pound does, but we're never seeing 150-inch bucks or 160-inch bucks. There ought to be a little siren going off that you've probably got some high grading. You probably have some harvest bias going on there. You're probably harvesting the very best bucks that would eventually get to 150, 160, 170, et cetera. Those bucks are probably being shot at 2 or 3 years of age. So you've done a wonderful job with your habitat management and the relationship of deer numbers to food supply. That part, you've knocked it out of the park. But you're failing on the side of your buck harvest regime. And so now you can kind of figure out what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong based on this relationship that you found.
Right. And many of the properties that I worked with, that high grading is absolutely happening. And, the 3-year-olds they're shooting, let's just say, might be 125. The 4-year-olds might be 127, and the 5-year-olds might be 124 inches. And so at that point, biologically, that's just not possible. And so that is perfectly displaying this issue of harvest bias that's occurring on many of these sites. And so absolutely, if you're not seeing the size of deer that you think you should be seeing, it may be that, pulling the trigger is the issue, and you're taking those best bucks when they're 3 years old.
Yeah. You mentioned the time lag in response of different metrics, and depending upon which component, bucks versus does, age classes of does, you might have differential time lags in the effects of a harvest rate on a variable. One of the issues in doe body weights is they're sensitive to whether or not the doe was lactating or not. And here in Mississippi, we have late enough fawning dates that we can use lactation rates of harvested does well into through November, even into early December, as an indication of reproductive success. But if you break up the body weights, say the adult 2 and 3-year-old does based on whether or not they were lactating or not at the time of harvest, the body weights can vary 10 pounds between those two categories. Lactating does are not going to have the same body weight as a non-lactating doe that lost her fawns early and didn't have that demand. We've often talked about the nutritional requirements for raising fawns. They're huge. Take that away from a doe and she can just eat and start gaining weight back, and so she's going to be heavier. So did you evaluate that, and how might that be a consideration in the topic that you're addressing today?
Right. So that's a great point, and that's something that initially I think we had, really high hopes of being able to evaluate things like that. Because certainly, y'all have documented very well the change in body mass related to date of harvest, as well as related to lactation and things like that. Unfortunately, with the data sets that we had, we didn't have consistent enough data collection on things like lactation. And then you also combine that with the fact that we're looking at, I mean, the variation in breeding dates that we would have been, had to incorporate. On some sites, they don't even have necessarily true, average breeding dates, established based on either the state agency or things like that. So we did not include a change based on either lactation status or date of harvest. Now, I think if we did that, that would improve our ability to predict changes in antler size. But the good news is, there's kind of a plus and a minus to both approaches. We took the approach that was simpler, and I think that's a strength in that anybody can go out there and collect female body mass data, and again, just using tooth replacement, come up with an average body mass across their property. But if I was a landowner that really wanted to hone in on changes in body mass, I certainly would try to incorporate some of the predictive equations related to lactation status and harvest date that y'all have developed, because I think there's a lot of value to that. Unfortunately, just from a practical standpoint, we weren't able to do that as part of this project.
Plus, we're a little bit spoiled too, Steve. A lot of the properties Mark was working with, he didn't have 500 doe samples where he could break it apart like that. So, that basically just had to group it, and then you just hope that that type of variation just smooths out due to the power of all the different study areas he had. Yeah, and very good point.
And as biologists, we don't worry about a pound or two variation from one year to the next, because it's probably sample size variation that's affecting just the value. I mean, we need to see measurable changes in body weights of. I like to look at yearling doe weights. And did you look? Well, heck, there's a follow-up question. Did you look at yearling doe body weights?
I did. There was a relationship. I don't know off the top of my head what it was, but I think it was less, if I remember correctly, it was a little bit less strong, but that was almost entirely related to just limited sample size. Some of the sites were not collected, some of the sites that were especially a little bit smaller acreage, we barely had sufficient sample size on adult females. And so, I think trying to hone in on yearlings would have been interesting, but it would have really reduced the number of deer that we would have been able to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Well, just for the data nerds out there, if you look at the body weights of lactating yearling does versus non-lactating yearling does, and then 2.5 and then 3.5 plus, you see a different pattern in yearling does than you do at 2 and 3 years of age. At 2 and 3 years of age, the lactating does are always going to be, well, never say always, never say never, but they're generally going to be lower by 5 to 10 pounds. But the yearling lactating does are typically heavier than the non-lactating does. And I love asking my students after 2 hours of lecture on this type of topic. I say, all right, who can explain this to me? And many times they don't get it. Nobody volunteers the answer. But the answer is the yearling does that are lactating had to have bred as fawns. And to be able to breed as a fawn, you have to be bigger to begin with. You have to reach a critical body mass. And so that effect of being just a bigger fawn is still prevalent in the yearling data. And so lactating yearlings still on average are going to be heavier than non-lactating yearlings. But then when you get into the 2 and then 3.5 plus, it flips around to lactating. The demand of lactation on an adult doe who has been producing fawns year after year is just driving that relationship. But anyway, enough, another little data nerd factoid there.
Notice, Bronson, he didn't give me or you the chance to answer. I don't think he has much faith in us.
Yeah, I was getting ready to answer that question, but you answered it for us. Okay. Well, Mark, thank you so much. We want to be respectful of your time. We do have some more content. We want to talk about Bergman's rule and the effect of latitude, heat conservation, heat dissipation, etc., all those effects. But we will do that on another episode if you do not mind joining us again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Always happy to.
And
All right.
Bronson, if any of our listeners want the full 4-hour lecture on condition indices and understanding DMAP data, I'm happy to, if they want to call and I like charge $80 a minute on my phone to lecture to anybody that wants to listen.
Actually, Steve, I think pretty sure you already have that on some of the seminars that we put on YouTube. Yes,
it is actually. It's already in there, so they can watch it for free. But that doesn't allow me to make $80 a minute on my phone.
Yeah. So for all those listening, I highly recommend you go to the YouTube channel and watch it there.
I still ramble in that also.
Yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. That is a property of Damaris. That is a fixed trait.
Yeah.
You will get a ramble. Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.